She stepped off that train wearing a name that wasn't hers. The wind tugged at her coat like it already knew she didn't belong. No one greeted her with flowers. No husband held out a hand. But when the quiet man in the hat met her eyes across the station yard, he didn't ask questions. He just tipped his hat and said, "You look tired, ma'am. Let's get you home." What he didn't know was that she wasn't the bride he'd written letters to. That woman had died weeks ago. And in a moment of desperation, the woman standing before him, a widow with no family, no money, and a past too broken to retell, picked up someone else's letter and ran west with nothing but borrowed hope. Most folks wouldn't have noticed her. Too plain, too quiet, too old for new beginnings. But he noticed. He gave her shelter. He offered kindness without asking why her hands shook when she lit a lantern. And he taught her what it meant to live without proving her worth every single day. But in a town like this, secrets don't stay buried long. When the truth came out that she wasn't the real Caroline Dawson, that she had arrived on false promises and hidden grief, the town turned cold. Whispers crept like frost across every window, and just when she thought she'd lose everything again, he did something no man ever had before. He stayed. What happens when love is built on a lie, but survives because of truth? What did this woman leave behind? Why did the townspeople say she should be punished even after everything she endured? And how did one man's quiet loyalty change her fate and theirs? Stay with us as we tell the rest of this soul-stirring tale. Because sometimes the deepest love story isn't the one that starts with a wedding, but with a lie, a storm, and someone who chooses to stay anyway. Ready to see what happens next? Eleanor Finch stepped off the eastbound stage with a borrowed name, a stitched-up satchel, and the kind of silence that only grows after too many years of being told to hush. She was 51, twice promised, once abandoned, once widowed. But none of that mattered now, not if she could play her part well enough to pass. The town was called Crescent Hollow, a quiet outpost where the cottonwoods leaned like eavesdroppers, and strangers were remembered by the shape of their boots. Eleanor was not the bride who was meant to arrive that week. That woman, Caroline Dawson, younger dainty, recently deceased in a train derailment, had dropped from the earth just as Eleanor had been searching for a way to escape her brother-in-law's home, where she'd been treated as furniture since her husband's death. The letter had been in her lap by accident. The photograph tucked inside had fallen like a sign, and something in her tired, desperate defiant had whispered, "You could take her place." Just long enough to survive. So she did. The man at the edge of the platform was taller than she expected. Gideon Hartwell, the widowed rancher who'd sent for a mail-order bride out of quiet necessity, not longing. He held his hat awkwardly, watching her with kind but squinted eyes like someone trying to read handwriting in low light. "You must be Miss Dawson." She swallowed, nodded once. Yes, Caroline. She had never told a lie so big with such a small voice. But he didn't question it. He just tipped his head toward the waiting wagon. "Well then, welcome to the Hollow." That first ride out to the ranch was painted in stillness. He spoke little. She spoke less. The fields passed by like pages of someone else's life. But she saw the signs, the cracked barn door, the weathered hands, the empty second coffee mug beside his on the wagon bench. This was a man who once believed in companionship, who had once waited for someone to return home. Now he was just waiting for someone not to leave. That night, Eleanor slept in a bed that wasn't hers, under a name that didn't belong to her, in a house she had no right to call home. And yet, the sheets smelled like fresh soap. There were clean towels folded at the foot, and a note in careful script, "Rest easy. You're safe here." But nothing safe lasts long when built on a lie. And Eleanor knew the question wasn't if her truth would come out. It was what would happen when it did. What happens when the one place that feels like refuge is the place you have no right to claim. Eleanor Finch, or Caroline Dawson, as Crescent Hollow believed, had lived quietly in the ranch house for 3 weeks. No questions, no suspicions. People were kinder than she ever expected. Gideon Hartwell, ever thoughtful, had offered her the room where his late wife had once slept. He didn't push. He simply said, "Everything here blooms in its own time." Folks, too. Of all the things he could have said, that one stuck. But the past is like a buried thorn. It always works its way back to the surface. At Mrs. Calhoun's general store, while picking up flour and some thread to mend Gideon's shirt, Eleanor heard a voice that turned her spine to ice. "Eleanor Finch, that's you, isn't it?" She turned. "Georgia Whitby. A distant relation by her late husband's side stood staring with wide eyes and a jaw hung open like she'd seen a ghost. They said you'd gone east, but here you are pretending to be someone else. Eleanor steadied herself. I'm afraid you're mistaken. My name is Caroline Dawson. George's eyes narrowed. No, you're not. I met Caroline in Kansas. She was younger, smaller, and she died in that train wreck. I know it. The walk back to the ranch was heavy, heavier than any guilt she'd carried. The lie had started small, but lies never stay small. They grow, curl, and eventually suffocate everything true. That night at supper, Gideon was quiet, but not cold, just noticing. He finally spoke as she passed him the bread. Is there something you're not telling me, Caroline? Not an accusation, just a question. Gentle, earnest, the kind that invites honesty. She almost confessed. Almost. But all that came out was, I'm just tired. Another lie. But this time, Gideon's eyes didn't believe her fully. What happens when the one person who begins to truly see you starts to wonder if they ever knew you at all? By the following Sunday, Eleanor knew the storm had begun. Georgia Whitby's gossip spread faster than dry brush fire. In a town as small and hungry for news as Crescent Hollow, it didn't take long before glances lingered too long at the bakery, or conversations hushed when she stepped into the post office. They didn't say it out loud, but Eleanor heard it anyway. Imposter, pretender, fraud. She no longer fit the image of the mail-order bride folks expected. Not dainty, not sweet-tongued, not young, and now, not even real. And yet each night when she returned to Gideon Hartwell's home, he never said a word of it. He noticed her tired eyes, the way she held her shoulders tight, the way she watched the door as if waiting for someone to knock and strip away the fragile peace she'd built. He never asked, but he saw. And sometimes, that's worse than confrontation. That Thursday, she found him sanding the porch railing in the soft evening light. She stood at the edge of the steps, hands curled in her apron, unsure whether to speak or keep pretending. They're saying things, she finally said. He didn't stop sanding. Are they true? Silence fell like dusk around them. Some of them, she whispered. He nodded once, slow. You'll tell me when you're ready. It wasn't a demand, just space. And space to someone like Eleanor was more grace than she'd ever been given. But even as his patience held her, the town's whispers thickened. The preacher's wife no longer invited her for sewing circle. Children stopped waving. Even Mrs. Calhoun, once all smiles and cinnamon drops, handed her change without meeting her eyes. That night, Eleanor stood in the mirror, brushing her silver-threaded hair, and saw not a woman but a question. Who are you pretending to be, and who are you still allowed to become? She couldn't live like this forever, couldn't love like this either. She'd found a man who saw her more clearly than anyone ever had, and yet didn't even know her name. What happens when the truth you've hidden begins to push out the love you've barely begun to believe in? The sun had already slipped behind the cottonwoods when Eleanor stepped into the parlor, her hands trembling around a folded letter. Gideon Hartwell sat in his chair by the fire glasses perched low on his nosebook, resting unread on his lap. He looked up at her, quiet as always, and yet waiting. She stood there for a moment, heart-aching, knees hollow, and then handed him the letter. I wrote it 3 times, but I think I need to say it instead. He set the letter aside. Then say it. Her voice didn't break. It bent. My name is Eleanor Finch, not Caroline Dawson. She died in that train wreck. I was never supposed to be here. I wasn't running toward anything. I was running away. From a house where I was nothing. From people who said I'd had my chance at happiness and failed. When the letter came, hers not mine, it was like a door opened in a wall I thought I'd die behind. She looked at him now fully. I lied, but not because I wanted to deceive you. I just wanted to breathe again. The fire cracked softly. He didn't speak. Not yet. So she went on. I'll leave if you want. I won't blame you. I never expected to be chosen, only to be useful for a while. Then she whispered what she'd feared most. You've been kind, and I have nothing to offer you but the truth of who I am. Gideon stood slowly, the light drawing the creases around his tired eyes. He stepped forward, not to scold, not to accuse, but to look into her as a man looks into the last part of his own soul. You want to know what I see, he said. I see a woman who fed my horses when her hands ached, who mended my shirts without asking, who listens when I have no words. You think you lied your way in here, Eleanor? He shook his head, voice low as dusk. You earned every square foot of this place by staying when it got hard. That's more honest than most folks ever manage. Her breath caught. She didn't cry. Not yet. but something in her cracked open just wide enough for warmth to enter. He touched her hand, just the edge of it, and added, "You don't have to leave, not unless it's what you want." And for the first time in years, Eleanor didn't feel like a guest in someone else's story. She felt invited. What does it mean to be chosen not for a name or a promise, but for who you truly are beneath the silence? The days that followed felt strange to Eleanor, not heavy with dread, but light with the unfamiliar weightlessness of having nothing left to hide. She still wore the name Caroline Dawson in town out of habit and mercy, but in the house with Gideon Hartwell, she was wholly Eleanor now. And Gideon called her that with a gentleness that made her feel like the name had never been a burden. Still, she braced herself for rejection, from the town, from the folks who had not long ago begun pulling away. But then something unexpected happened. Mrs. Calhoun invited her in for coffee again. No mention of names, just a warm slice of pear cake and a soft, knowing nod. The children outside the church began waving again, as if they'd forgotten the whispers or forgiven them. Even Georgia Whitby, of all people, walked past her one morning, paused, then muttered without meeting her eyes, "Guess you turned out all right after all." Eleanor let it be enough. The greatest change, though, bloomed in the quietest place, the space between her and Gideon. They spoke more now, laughed sometimes, shared supper not out of politeness but rhythm. And on evenings when the lanterns glowed amber and the crickets stirred, they sat together in long silences that weren't empty anymore. One night he handed her a small wooden box, inside a brooch in the shape of a sycamore leaf. "It's not a ring," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "Not yet, just something to say you belong." Eleanor's hands shook as she pinned it to her collar. She didn't say yes. She didn't need to. She stayed. And in staying, she found not only shelter but home, not in the walls or the porch swing or the stitched curtains, but in being seen, fully, and still being chosen. Sometimes the most radical kind of love is staying even after the truth has been told. Would you like more stories like this one, or a continuation of Eleanor and Gideon's quiet life together? Let me know in the comments. And if this story touched something in you, please consider subscribing to None Wild West Saga for more healing tales under the wide western sky. Let's keep sharing stories worth sitting down for. Eleanor had begun to believe peace could last. She cooked, she gardened. She stitched Gideon's name into a linen napkin and didn't flinch when he called her his Eleanor in town. There was no proposal, no wedding bands, just the tender, ordinary dailiness of two people building something neither dared name. But spring in Crescent Hollow brought more than rain. One morning a man arrived, dust-covered coat, city boots, a wax-sealed envelope in his hand. He asked for Caroline Dawson, and when Eleanor stepped forward, something in her spine went cold. "I'm Marshall Boone," he said, "Pinkerton agent." The name struck like lightning. He knew, and Gideon, standing on the porch behind her, knew it too. "You're not in trouble, ma'am," the man said gently. "But there are folks back east still asking questions. Your husband's death was ruled an accident, but you disappeared before anyone could ask why he left a will. In your name only." The world dimmed at the edges. She whispered, "I didn't kill him. I know," the man said. "But townspeople back there think you stole from him. They never believed a woman like you could earn that kind of inheritance." And there it was, the oldest wound, a woman too plain to be loved, too poor to be trusted, too old to be believed. Gideon stepped forward, voice low. "She stays with me." Marshall gave a half nod. "I'll give you time, but someone's going to want an answer soon." Then he tipped his hat and rode off. That night, Eleanor didn't speak much. She sat at the table long after the plates were cleared, hands folded tight, watching the fire glow low. Finally, she said, "You could ask me to leave. I wouldn't fight you. I wouldn't blame you." Gideon looked at her like he was seeing her not just now, but fully. "I didn't build this life with you just to watch it blow away." "But I lied," she said. "You survived," he answered. And for the first time, she believed maybe those things weren't so far apart. When the past knocks again, will love be strong enough to answer the door? The morning after Marshall Boone left, the sky opened with rain. Eleanor stood on the porch in her shawl, watching droplets patter into the dry soil, each one carving the earth like time itself. She felt exposed, but not afraid. In her hands was a letter, unsent. It bore no lies this time, no disguise, just one woman's plain telling of where she'd been, and what she hoped the world might still let her become. Gideon came up behind her, slid a mug of coffee into her hand, and kissed the top of her head without saying a word. That's what made her cry, not the storm, not the shame, but the knowing. She was loved as she was no more hiding, no more proving. just being. Weeks passed. A letter returned from back east. The estate she'd inherited cleared, her name no longer questioned. Whatever doubts lingered had melted beneath the sheer steady truth of a life lived out loud, and the town softened. Children returned to her fence line with dandelions. Mrs. Calhoun brought her cuttings of honeysuckle. Even Georgia Whitby, red-faced and awkward, muttered one afternoon, "I was wrong about you." Eleanor smiled. "I was wrong about me too." One golden evening, Gideon knelt beside her in the garden. "No rings, no parties," he said, voice rough from emotion, "just you and me. And if you'll stay, I'd like to call this forever." She didn't say yes. She just leaned her head to his shoulder and let the quiet speak for them. The woman who had arrived under false name, false hope, and the weight of everything she wasn't, now stood in a home she hadn't lied her way into, but earned with truth, tenderness, and time. And sometimes the most remarkable love story is the one that unfolds when you stop pretending you're unworthy of love. Did this story stir something in you? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Would you like to see more stories like Eleanor's, or maybe a follow-up to her quiet life with Gideon? If so, consider subscribing to Nun Wild West Saga, where late-blooming love, second chances, and soft redemption still grow beneath the western sky. You're always welcome here. Sometimes we carry a name that isn't ours, because the one we were born with has too much sorrow stitched into it. But the beauty of love, the kind that lasts, is that it sees past the names, past the shame. It doesn't ask for perfection. It only asks, will you stay? Eleanor didn't come west looking for romance. She came to disappear quietly, completely. But in the stillness of a man who didn't need her to explain herself, and in the silence of a small town that slowly, quietly softened, she discovered something she never dared hope for, again, belonging. Not because she earned it, not because she lied well enough, but because someone finally looked at her and said, "You've had enough taken from you. Let me be the one who gives something back." Maybe you've known a kind of sorrow like hers. Maybe you've worn a mask thinking the truth of you was too much to bear. But here's a gentle reminder. You're not too late. You're not too broken. And someone somewhere is still capable of seeing all of you and staying. If this story touched your heart, we'd be honored if you'd subscribe to Nun Wild West Saga, where tales of quiet redemption, late-blooming love, and healing under wide skies continue. Leave us a comment below. Would you like to see what becomes of Eleanor and Gideon's new life? Or hear another story like this one? You matter here, and you're always welcome.